Hello, Garland Nixon here. We're hanging out with Caleb Maupin. Plenty to talk about. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here. Today we are hanging out with the one and only Caleb Maupin. Caleb, he has a great organization at CPI USA, the Center for Political Innovation. Caleb, a little bit about your organization and where people can find it.
Well, we just had a great National Day of Action. We had people in 6 different cities supporting peace talks with Russia. That's pretty great. More video of that's coming out pretty soon. We're the Center for Political Innovation. We put on conferences. We publish books. We have events, reading groups. We have a meeting every Saturday. Yeah, we're doing great stuff. Got people in different parts of the country. We're going to kick off the new year in January with a special reception. That'll be in New Jersey. So that'll be, keep an eye out for the announcement for that soon. But yeah, we're a good group of folks. We had people out in the streets, Minneapolis, Chicago, Boston, New York, Los Angeles, Portland. We had people out there, waving our placards that say, "Thank you, Tulsi," and "We support peace talks, end Ukraine war." And so it's a good group of people.
Now, let's start with good old, what's his name? Mamdani, the guy that's running for office in New York. I've been suspect of him for a while because, Bernie, AOC. Yeah, what's the old saying? A person who's, or what is it? A cat who jumps on a hot stove will never jump on another one, nor will he jump on a cold stove. So anytime I see somebody coming out and they're Democratic Socialist of America, DSA, I'm like, bad experiences with DSA. They're just warmongering people, want to be Democrats to try to pretend they're left of the Democratic Party, and they're never. Anyway, before I throw this to you, his wife, I think, is surrounded by spookery. Don't trust her. You can't find anything about her. No background, no nothing. Let me read old Charlie Kirk's latest statement. His campaign sent out a statement after the interview. This is him. He did an interview on a podcast. He was didn't say much about Venezuela, etc. So this came out from him, from his campaign. I want to be clear on where I stand. I believe both Nicolas Maduro and Miguel Diaz-Canel are dictators. Oh boy, he's using the language of the imperialist. Their administrations have stifled free and fair elections. Isn't that interesting? Because I didn't see that when I watched their elections. And Jimmy Carter said, boy, these are the cleanest elections I've ever seen in my life. Jailed political opponents, such as the ones that tried to overthrow his government on behalf of the United States, and suppressed the free and fair press. In other words, they shut down puppet media organizations that were run by the CIA. And yet, our federal government's long history of punitive, I love this, and yet, our government's long history of punitive policies towards both countries, including extrajudicial killings of Venezuelans and the continuation of decades-long blockade of Cuba, have only worsened these conditions. Oh, so Maduro and Canal are bad, and they've done horrible things, and the things that we've done have only made them worse. We didn't create these problems. Democratic socialism is about dignity, justice, and accountability. And above all, it's about building a democracy that works for working people, not one that preys on them. In light of the current moves by the Trump administration to threaten Venezuela, it would seem to be a particularly bad time for a so-called democratic socialist to make a statement like this.
Well, I got to tell you what happened, though. After he made that statement, all the people that think he's a communist and think he's untrustworthy because he's a communist or a socialist, they all said, "Oh, he denounced Venezuela. Okay, we're all going to vote for him now, and he's going to win the election." He won over the support of all the people that were suspicious of him. Of course, I'm being sarcastic and facetious there, but it really goes to show you that there is a weird element of. I honestly don't think, and I'll just be honest here, I don't think he made that statement to get votes. I think he made that statement to reassure the deep state. That statement was made for the U.S. foreign policy establishment. And I think about, when Bernie Sanders was running for president the second time, right, against Biden in the primaries, and then the pandemic happened and we didn't really have much of a primary. But when that was going on, you remember 60 Minutes did their hit piece on him.
Yep.
And it was all about how in the 80s, 40 years ago, Bernie Sanders had praised Cuba, had praised the government of Nicaragua. And they pressed Bernie Sanders on it, and he did the same thing. Oh, Maduro's a tyrant. Cuba's awful. He did the whole thing. But it looked to me like that was basically the American deep state saying, this guy potentially could go the other way. 40 years ago, he took foreign policy positions we didn't agree with, and he's not trustworthy. And the New York Times ran some interesting articles about, he went over to Russia. And, he was going over to Russia courting the Gorbachev wing. I mean, there was a whole lot of American officials that were going over to Russia in the late 80s, courting the Gorbachev wing, setting the stage for the fall of the Soviet Union. But it was like, Bernie Sanders was seen as somebody who could potentially stray from the U.S. foreign policy script. And that's why his campaign was just not allowed to happen. Excuse me. Just not allowed to happen. And it looks to me like Mamdani is trying to reassure anyone who's worried that he might stray from U.S. foreign policy narratives that he won't. That's what it looks like to me. And you don't gain any credibility. And that's kind of what has always kind of annoyed me about this kind of stuff. Excuse me, just having some fall allergies there. It has always annoyed me when people do this, when they try to get credibility. The idea is, so some country is being demonized for being socialist or communist or whatever. And so I'll denounce them and I'll say, well, that's not real socialism. I'm for this other thing. And then people will like me. It doesn't work that way. And if anything, it just comes across as weak. The standard talking point is, right, they say, well, communism's killed 100 gajillion million people everywhere it's ever been tried. It's been a complete failure. So why should we ever try it again? And if your only response to that is, oh, that's true, but you really have no ground to stand on, right? If you can't go up against that narrative. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't be critical of what has happened. But the whole reason I got interested in all of this was I was brought up with that same narrative. I was a kid in the 90s after the Soviet Union had fallen. We were told communism just doesn't work anywhere. It just has never had any economic successes. It always leads to starvation. And, that's why we can't have health care in America, because that's kind of like communism. And, I didn't realize it, but every other country in the Western world has a national health care service. We can't have it here because that's communism and it'll just lead to everyone being starving and miserable. And, I was spoon-fed this stupid anti-communism. And then I came across basic economic data. The Soviet Union did build the world's largest power plant at the time of the 1930s. They built the Dnieper Dam, and they built the world's largest steel industry. And they, lifted the whole country up, and they defeated the Nazis. They invented space travel. They had the first mobile phone that they patented in 1957, Leonid Kaprianovich. And what I had been told about communism, well, it just doesn't work. That was just not true. It just didn't match reality. And that the entire premise of American political discourse was based on this lie. And it's that whole thing that people quote from, Hitler, from Mein Kampf, where Hitler, he says, if you lie big, people will believe it, because people lie about little things. But if you tell a lie that's just so big and so sweeping, people will just assume it's true, because why would you lie that big? This idea that communism has never had any successes, that socialism and communism, they just never worked anywhere. What was China before the Communist Party came in? What is China now? Look at that, right? What was the Soviet Union when the Bolsheviks took power? And what were they by the 1930s? What were they at the time they defeated Hitler? What were they by the 1960s, where they were racing to the moon against the United States and were a global superpower? Some things are true and some things are not. I mean, look at Libya. Under the leadership of Gaddafi with a socialist planned economy, Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. They built the great man-made river, the world's largest irrigation system. They had the highest rate of literacy, the highest life expectancy. People from all over Africa were trying to go to Libya because Gaddafi had a policy that any African who came to Libya would be guaranteed a job. And so Libya had Africans piling in to get employment. And then Gaddafi was overthrown, and now Libya, they've joined the glorious free market system. Now they don't even have full electrification. And now people are drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get out of the nightmare that's been created, right? So, I mean, this story, and even, Cuba has its difficulties, but in terms of life expectancy, it's one of the highest in Latin America. And, you compare it to any of the other Caribbean islands, compare it to Jamaica, compare it to Haiti, compare it to the Dominican Republic, they're doing pretty well. Compare it to Honduras, compare it to Guatemala. I've been to Nicaragua. Nicaragua has a revolutionary socialist government. Compare Nicaragua to Guatemala, to Honduras, to Panama even. If you look at it, right? I mean, we have all these refugees and these people piling into our country. Very few of them are coming from Nicaragua, right? They're coming from Honduras. They're coming from Guatemala. They're coming from Mexico. They're coming from El Salvador, some of them, but they're not coming from Nicaragua. Nicaragua's government has had great achievements. And this whole narrative that we've been spoon-fed, it is just false. And that, that has always been my frustration. I think the first time I encountered Trotskyites, from the International Socialist Organization, they sold me their newspaper. We're a socialist group. I was at an immigrant protest. It was around the time, 2005, I think. There was a big immigrant protest. I was a high school student. And there was the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, the Trotskyites. And they sold me their newspaper. And I opened it. And, they had their 5 main points. Point number 1. Russia, China, Venezuela, Cuba, all of these countries have nothing to do with socialism. They're all brutal dictatorships. And I thought, what is this? How are you helping anything, right? That the American discourse is premised on the big lie. And you're trying to say, well, I agree with the big lie, but, and it does sound crazy. And a lot of the right-wing anti-communist stuff, you listen to Jordan Peterson and all of that, it makes a very good point. If you accept the premise that everywhere you've ever had socialism, everywhere you've ever had communism, it's been awful. And then your argument is, well, somehow I know better. I'm going to do it better. You do sound kind of crazy. That is kind of a crazy argument. The thing is, that's not true. That's just simply not true, but it requires an element of intellectual courage, right? You have to be able to say, look, CNN lies, right? New York Times lies. People have it in their heads, and I really don't get it. People that are in those Mamdani circles, they have it in their heads that there's going to be a country somewhere, a country in Latin America, a country in Asia, a country in Africa, and they're going to have a revolution, and they're going to have a socialist government, and they're going to totally respect human rights, and they're going to do everything right. And the New York Times is going to say, well, by golly, we don't agree with them, but they're doing the right thing. We respect them. Good show, chap. You win this round. That's what they think is going to happen. And the reality is, no matter what, they call it a brutal dictatorship. And for me, I have seen Venezuela, as have you. When I was in Venezuela in 2015 during the elections, the Democratic Roundtable, the MUD, they had ads on the television. They had people in the streets having rallies. Most of the TV networks in Venezuela were supporting them and were against the government. They bent over backwards to accommodate them. They even let them design the ballot. They have a special way that the ballot is the layout of the ballot is designed, and the opposition gets to, have a vote in how the ballot is designed. They did everything they could to accommodate them. But you turn on American television, Venezuela is a brutal dictatorship. It doesn't matter, no matter what. It's dictatorship when they lose. And there was an article in the Wall Street Journal a few years back, this new concept, and it's catching like fire among academia. They call it democratic regression. Have you heard this term, democratic regression? And they say, if a country elects a leader, but that leader tampers with independent institutions, then it becomes a dictatorship. And they use Russia as the example in Venezuela. So no one disputes that Putin has won the elections fair and square in Russia, but they say Putin tampered with independent institutions like the police, like the military, like the business community. So then it's not a dictatorship. Or they say Venezuela, sure, maybe Hugo Chavez won the election, but he tampered with the independent institutions. Well, these institutions they're calling independent, they're not independent, right? Russia's economy in the 90s was not independent. It was under the control of Wall Street. And Putin got elected on a mandate of fixing that. and then he must be a dictator because he tampered with independent institutions, right? The Venezuelan military, before Hugo Chavez, before Maduro, they weren't independent. They went around breaking strikes and disappearing students and coordinating with the CIA and other people. They weren't independent. And Hugo Chavez got elected and he changed that. So now he's a dictator. So basically, now, according to American academia, it's not, being a dictator isn't a question of whether the people vote for you or not. It's a question of, if you get elected and you change things, it's dictatorship, because it's just supposed to naturally be the way that serves Wall Street and American imperialism. And that's starting to be the argument they use. And I mean, it kind of reminds me, when I was in Iran, Iran is very open about the fact, they say, well, look, we're not a total democracy in Iran. We are not. They said, we are a guided democracy. We have elections, we have political parties, but we have this thing called the Guardian Council, the leaders of the Islamic Revolution, that make sure that the candidates are in line with the teachings of the Islamic Revolution. And they said, that's not pure democracy, right? This Guardian Council, these religious leaders that are nonpartisan, they have the authority to allow or disallow candidates. And they said, you have the same thing in America. It's called Wall Street. It's called the mainstream media. And they say, now, which is better? Is it having the people guide your democracy, the people that led your revolution, the people that are the leaders of your religion, that have built up this country and all of that, or the people who just happen to have the most money? Which is better? Well, obviously, it's better to have people that, have proven themselves, have a record of doing things, than people who just happen to have the most money. And that's the way it is over here. And that, this term dictatorship, again, it's dictatorship if you're interfering with the natural way of doing things, right? That naturally they're just supposed to be at the top. And if you interfere with that, then you're being authoritarian. That's kind of the way they put it. And I mean, in some of my work, I've looked into, there was this book that was very, very popular in post-World War II America. Harry Truman, it was his favorite book. I think Dwight Eisenhower really liked it. It's called The True Believer. And it's an academic book by Eric Hoffer that goes over the history of mass movements. And it argues that mass movements are cheating, is basically the argument, right? That if the religious institutions, if there's some religious leader who doesn't become popular in the prevailing religious institutions, he starts a mass movement to make himself popular, he's cheating. If there's somebody in the political sphere who just doesn't, rise up the ranks in the normal political parties, well, they start a mass movement. And it's this argument that, the way religious and political institutions are is just how they're supposed to be. And if somebody goes outside and starts a mass movement to try and change things, they're cheating, they're redundant, right? That's kind of the argument that they're making. It's a very, very interesting way of looking at things. It has a lot to do with neoconservatism, though. And that's, I wrote this book, Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, where I go over where DSA came from. DSA and the neocons originate in the same split among Trotskyites. Max Shachtman, Irving Howe, Irving Kristol, Michael Harrington, they were all in the same group in the 1950s up into the 60s. And then some became Republicans and some became Democrats. It's interesting history to go over, but really at the essence of it is that in the West, we live in liberalism. The idea of, the individual above all else, no collectivism. Liberalism is always dependent on illiberalism. Right. And that is one of the big contradictions, right? At the same time that our founding fathers were writing about everyone's equal and we believe in the rights of man, they had thousands of slaves, right? They obviously did, and that, you can talk about how we respect human rights and all of that, but the USA would never have defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War if they didn't have all kinds of brutal military dictatorships they were aligned with, like Park Chung-hee in South Korea, like in Indonesia and all kinds of places. So Taiwan, yeah, Chiang Kai-shek with his white terror that, killed hundreds of thousands of people. And I mean, so there's so many examples of this, that liberalism is really a house of cards. But the premise of Western society is we're democratic and our opponents are not. And the more you look into it, the more you start to realize that just doesn't add up. And that when it really gets down to it, and this is something where I would argue with Mamdani, and if I could ever sit down with him, I would point this out. And I don't know if he would like to hear this or not. You really talk about what democracy means. Democracy means the rule of the people. That's what it literally means. It doesn't mean freedom. It just means the people rule. I would argue Cuba and Venezuela are more democratic than America. Why?
Oh, far more.
Because the people are involved. The people are involved. You go to Venezuela, every neighborhood, they have a Bolivarian circle where the people get together and they say, how can we carry out the goals of the revolution? How can we operate in our neighborhood? The people are heavily involved. In Cuba, in every block, they have the Committee to Defend the Revolution, the CDR. And the Cuban government, if it didn't have thousands and thousands and probably millions of people that every day wake up and say, it is my job to make sure we carry out the goals of the Communist Party, they would fall really quickly if they didn't have that well-organized population. The same for Venezuela. There have been so many coup attempts and all that. If they didn't have all kinds of people organized and involved, they would fall. So that's very different than our government. Our government doesn't want us involved at all. They would rather that we all just, be watching football or doing something else, So in a way, they're more democratic. Maybe, in Cuba, especially, you could argue maybe they don't have the same level of freedom of speech. They certainly do in Venezuela. They got plenty of freedom of speech in Venezuela. Cuba, maybe it's a little bit different. It's the old Soviet model. But the government is still reliant on a very heavily involved population, and that is more democratic in the true sense of the word. The people are involved in running and ruling.
Let me give you an example. One of the concerns in Venezuela, overthrowing Venezuela, and it always has been, is that they've literally armed millions of people. And they say, we're ready for armed struggle. That's the term they use. I know, because I heard them say it. I was there. And they've literally given militia uniforms to millions of people, right? And the government, here's your gun. Here's an AK-47. Here's your bullets. Here's your whatever it is. You got to be ready to fight.
I thought Joe Biden was a socialist taking our guns away. I'm just kidding. Go ahead. But
now, exactly. So here's my point. If Maduro's a dictator who hates the people, why would he arm the people? And once he armed the people, if they hated him and he was a dictator, wouldn't they then take those arms and overthrow the government? Apparently, Maduro has no fear of that, does he? I'm going to give the people guns and I'm going to say, let's fight for our freedom. The United States government would never do that, because they'd be afraid that the people would overthrow the government because they mistreat them. So one of the keys to understand that they're bullcrapping you about Venezuela is the fact that the Venezuelan government, goes around to the people and says, we'll stand together, we'll fight together. Here's your gun. Here's your bullets. Are you ready to fight to protect our democracy? And they say, we will fight to protect our democracy. You're not going to convince me that a dictator is going to arm the people of his country because they'll overthrow him.
Yeah, well, and Gaddafi did the same thing during the Libyan war, right? He had trucks just going around handing guns out because he knew the people would point them in the right direction. And generally a government that is concerned that people might not point the guns in the right direction doesn't go around handing out guns. In my experience, Venezuela, you could say this about most anti-imperialist countries, actually, about a third, right? In my experience. I mean, I haven't done a huge amount of research or whatever. I've just based it in my experience, my assessment. You got a third of the people that are kind of against the government, right? They're frustrated, corruption, whatever. They watch American stuff on their phone, whatever. You got a third of the people like that. Then you got a third of the people that are positive on the government, but they're not like excited about it, right? They're just like, okay, well, in Venezuela, for example, when Hugo Chavez first got elected, they only had 10 public universities. Now they have 32, right? That's an improvement. They wiped out illiteracy. Okay, we get healthcare. So they're kind of positive on it, but they're not excited. They might have some complaints, whatever. But then you have this third of people that are really fanatical. They are all in, right? And that's Central Caracas. You go to the collectivos and the communes in Central Caracas. Those folks are all in. They are ready to die for that revolution. They are ideological. They understand they're on a mission. And, the ruling party in Venezuela is the United Socialist Party. But then there's these other parties that don't get as many votes in the elections that are part of the ruling coalition, the Patriotic Pole, they call it. And that's the Communist Party, the Homeland for All Party, right? The Homeland for All Party. And there's a couple others. There's the Tupac Amaro Party, which is an indigenous, communist party. And there's a couple of these very hardcore communist parties. And those people, they are all in. They are ready to go, right? And what I thought was interesting when I was in Venezuela is that, Venezuela is very much, it's from the Marxist tradition. I mean, they mix Catholicism in there. They mix, indigenous stuff. They're not like pure Soviet style Marxists, but they very much are influenced by Iran. When I was in there, I saw radio stations where they would have pictures of the Iranian supreme leader. And they talked about, when I visited the collectivos, they said, well, we studied Hezbollah, and we studied the Hezbollah in Lebanon and how they set up. And that, they kind of see themselves as part of a global anti-imperialist movement that has many different faces. I thought that was very, very, very interesting. The other thing that I thought was interesting when I was in Venezuela in 2015 was that, now it used to be, even on the left, taboo to talk about the Israel lobby. It was like you could talk against Israel, but Israel was a tool of U.S. imperialism. And if you start talking about the Israel lobby and stuff like that, you might be anti-Semitic. We don't know. Well, when I was in Venezuela in 2015, they talked about the neocons being tied in with Israel. They talked about, that book that Mearsheimer and Walt wrote, The Israel Lobby. Hugo Chavez, before he died, he waved that book around on TV, actually, and he talked about the neocons and the Trotskyites and the Israel lobby and all of that. And that was totally acceptable in Venezuela. And I think a lot of the American leftists who support Venezuela, maybe they didn't agree with that and they didn't want to highlight that, so we didn't hear that as much. But I heard that in Venezuela. They talked that way a lot, and they also, another thing I thought was interesting is that, when it comes to like Middle East connections, there was a Venezuelan military leader who was of Syrian descent who went to Syria and fought for the Syrian government, and that there are a number of Venezuelans that are Middle Eastern. And also the USA has put crippling sanctions on Venezuela and on Iran. So now there's like big Iranian supermarkets in Caracas, and that, and that every time like Iran would like send a new boat of stuff over to Venezuela, the Biden administration, the Trump administration, they can't do that. They can't do that. Well, yeah, they can. I mean, what do you mean they can't do that? You put sanctions on them. You're not letting them trade with you, so they're trading with each other. Like, excuse me, I mean, you didn't invite them to the party, so they're having a party of their own. Like, that's not your business. It was very weird. I thought the most interesting news story, though, Maduro says that they have prevented an attack on the American embassy. They saved the lives of the American diplomats in Venezuela. The right-wing opposition was going to blow up the U.S. embassy in Venezuela. Did you see this?
Well, yeah, and might I add, good and damn well that was CIA doing that. They were going to blow up their own embassy and kill their own people. Of course, that it was a false flag operation.
Indeed it was. And they were going to blow up the U.S. embassy. So Maduro saved the lives of a bunch of American diplomats. Trump should give him a medal for that, is what he should do. He should say, thank you for saving the lives of our service people and preventing a big war. They were going to try to trick me into this war by doing it. Obviously, that's not the case. But they're not going to give him a medal for doing that. But they saved American lives. And a couple things come to mind about this. Number one, you remember Havana syndrome?
Yes.
When the USA opened an embassy in Cuba, it was like the most bizarre story. Like the American diplomats there were getting sick or something. It was one of the most weird stories. What in the world?
Said they were using some kind of a noise thing, and that it was making people sick, and it was other parts of the world. It was absurd.
The whole thing was weird. It was very, very weird. And it was, it was CIA people, American diplomats that were being hit. So, I mean, and it wouldn't be in Cuba's interest. Cuba wants American diplomatic recognition. So what was going on there? And that's when, I listened to the statements of Maduro lately. He doesn't call out Trump. He calls out the Miami Mafia, and he calls out Marco Rubio. And he highlights that Marco Rubio's family, not only are they Cuban exiles, they've got ties to the drug trade, to the narco gangs, right? And that there is kind of a layer of criminal organizations in Miami, organized crime organizations that have been propped up by the American government. And it looks like those groups, they want the American government to take action against Cuba, against Venezuela. They don't want normal diplomatic relations. And it looks like they may be doing things that are at odds with the overall, interests of what the U.S. government is trying to accomplish. It looks like they may be acting independently. And that's very, very interesting, and I don't quite know what to say about it. I do know that the whole January 6th event, right, there were busloads, buses and buses and buses of Miami Cubans that came in on January 6th, and that was a big part of it. And we know January 6th involved all kinds of false flags and all of that. Also, the Epoch Times, that's Chinese exiles, people who hate the Chinese government, a religious fanatical group that's illegal in China and all of that. And there are these kind of independent groups that have a beef back home, and they are like demanding the U.S. government carry out their own personal vendetta. They're not thinking in the overall interests of imperialism. And that's kind of been the contradiction in the Trump, the Trump versus Biden camp. Biden's thinking of like, how do we maintain U.S. dominance overall? Trump has a collection of various, the Iranian, the Shahs of Sunset Park, and the Likudniks, the Netanyahu fans in Israel and all that. And he's trying to please these various constituencies. And there's a friend of mine who compared that to the fall of the Roman Empire, right? How, the Roman Empire, they brought in so many different foreign groups, basically, that they were aligned with, foreign kings, foreign religious sects. And it got towards the end, the Romans couldn't even bring up their own army. They couldn't raise their own army among Romans. So they had to pay, like when they were fighting the barbarian tribes in Germany, they had to find other Germans and pay them to fight them. They couldn't even raise their own army towards the end. They were so reliant on other people, and the unity within the empire itself had kind of fully collapsed. And you almost wonder if that's what's going on. Even the U.S. military now, I understand there's a really high amount of what they call green card soldiers.
Yeah,
right. Yeah, where these are not American citizens who are like, I love my country, I'm going to fight. They're people from other countries who have said, I want to become an American citizen, so I'm going to sign up, join the army from my country in order to get my green card. And at the end of their service, they'll get a green card. And so we're headed that way.
If I could add something.
Sure.
I did. Some of the people who watch the show may remember this a couple years ago. Chuck Schumer, what's his name? I can't think of his name, from Illinois, were saying what we need to do is we need to open the military. Exactly that. We need to open the military to foreigners and say, you can get your American citizenship if you join the military. At which point I said, that's an old game for imperialists. And the game is this: when we want to turn the military loose on the people, we got to have foreigners in it. Because if we say to the people, okay, they're people, if they don't mow them down, the American soldiers will say, those are my cousins and my brothers and my sisters and my family. I'm not shooting. These are my neighbors in my community. I'm not doing it. But if you bring a bunch of people from another country, and other countries, other cultures, desperations, if you don't do what I want, I'll send you back or kill you. Who knows? You don't have you don't have any rights, right? So I take my military, I fill it with people from God only knows what, wherever I can find them all over the world. And then when I say to them, there's the American people, guys, either you in this anti-Zionist rally or these soldiers are going to mow you down, these soldiers will mow them down, number one. And as we see the government saying we've got to send cities we've got to send troops into the cities. We've got to send troops here and there and quell the natives in the various cities. As I look at it, they're prepping up for that. And so it makes sense that as they start to say, well, people are going to push more against Zionism. Oh, we're going to have another 2008 style crash or even worse. And the people are going to come to the streets. Well, guess what? We got a bunch of military who's filled with people that aren't from America, who will do what they're told, or else they may get mowed down. Boom, there we have it. We have a compliant military who, if they're told to shoot Americans, will shoot Americans.
Well, it's funny because this is guys on the far right have been talking about this for years, right? Do you remember the black helicopters thing in the 90s? Yeah, I remember that when I was a kid. There were certain conspiracy-oriented people in my little town that were always seeing black helicopters. And I guess part of it was that if the sun is in front of it, every helicopter looks black. So, but there was this fear that like a foreign army would be used to like subdue the American population.
UN armies. Remember, they said it was the UN. It was going to be UN armies.
Yeah, the UN was going to take over. And that goes back to the whole John Birch Society about get us out of the UN and the UN out of us. And, that whole thing. And but it's interesting because we're starting to see, the American government is fully invested in this global international economic system. That's who they're defending with these wars. They're not defending the American people. And it used to be that part of the way imperialism worked was they underdeveloped and impoverished countries around the world, and they brought the spoils back home, and a layer of American working people got good paying jobs, et cetera. And part of it was they just needed the labor, right? They needed people in the steel mills and the auto plants and all that. Well, now they don't because of technology. They just don't need those folks. And on top of that, there's an element of they can't afford it anymore. And so the homelands, the Western imperialist homelands, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, are just kind of rotting from within. And that is a new phase. And we talk about destructive accumulation, where, at this point, the main way corporations are making money is by things that destroy productive power. Right? The prison industrial complex does not make this country more prosperous. You send people to prison, they come out traumatized, they've got a criminal record for the rest of their life. That's not making the country wealthier. You get people hooked on opioids for their whole life, right? You push doctors to overprescribe opioids. Yeah, the corporation might make some money, but you're going to have a population full of people that are addicted to opioids. That's not very productive. And that even a lot of the stuff with the hydraulic fracking and all of that, it's almost like we're kind of looting our own country. Our own country's kind of being looted, right? It's like a sheriff sale, or what do they call that? A fire sale on the country, where it's just like, every last thing they can scrape a profit out of. And it's like, even the people at the top realize there's not much left, and it's just kind of get what you can and run out the door while you can. It's kind of frightening to look at this and see how it's unfolding. And that, and then you can tie that in with what Pete Hegseth was doing. He put on that big show about, we gotta do push-ups, and, we can't have fat generals and all of this. And, it's like, what are they kidding? I keep thinking about Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg, she wrote that Junius pamphlet at the beginning of World War I, where she predicted, she said that, that World War I was the beginning of a process that would lead to a point where the economic system required constant war. And that's where we're at right now. I think the USA has been at war since 9/11, at least, right? Has there been any time we haven't been at war, where the system requires constant war just to keep going, right? This is this problem of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profits, right? That the amount of value and profit they're getting from each item is so low because the amount of human labor involved is so low, and the economy just keeps slowing down and coming to a halt because of these basic problems with the capitalist mode of production. And so they just have to keep destroying and have to have war constantly in order to keep the whole thing grinding ahead. It's utterly disastrous. And then big chunks of the world have said no to them, right? And the African continent, you have the Union of Sahel States. They're doing gangbusters over there. They're doing great. I mean, with the farming boom and the fisheries and the education programs. I mean, it's amazing. You read about what Ibrahim Traore is doing, and Mali. I mean, for all these years, they were making no progress against the terrorists. And now they kicked the UN out, and they brought the Wagner group in, and they're cooperating with Russia against the terrorists, and they're liberating whole villages. It's kind of amazing what's happening. And you look at what China's doing with the Belt and Road. One thing that's come up recently on a lot of my streams, is that, you want to talk about how to stop mass migration. China has a brilliant policy called the Belt and Road Initiative, right? The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, right? China's a very prosperous country, but you'll notice you don't have thousands and thousands of people from all the surrounding poor countries trying to pile into China. Why? Because China's going to them and building highways and building hospitals and building airports, and they can get wealthier in their own country by trading with China, right? And the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, Pakistan's a very poor country, and that mountainous region of Pakistan, it's very close to China, right? Mao Zedong in 1966, the Soviet Union had cut off Mao. So Mao was kind of at a loss. He wasn't aligned with the United States, and so he was kind of at a loss. But there was a kind of a nationalist military dictatorship in Pakistan. So Mao made an arrangement with the Pakistani military dictatorship, and they built the China-Pakistan Friendship Highway, which is the highest and largest elevated road in the world, right? It's a huge road connecting China to Pakistan over these mountainous regions, right? And China was still very poor at that point. Pakistan was very poor. And, people died. There were, casualties along the way, and it took them decades to build it. But they built this road connecting China to Pakistan. And that road laid the basis for the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which has really improved the lives of, millions of people in Central Asia, not just in Pakistan, but in all kinds of other parts of that region, right? That now that China has connected to Pakistan, and all these areas now, Pakistan is connected to the ocean, right? And Central Asia and all of those parts of Asia, they don't have ocean access. So if they produce goods, they can't put them on ships and ship them somewhere. But now, because of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, because of railway access that they've created in those mountains, You know, I mean, they've really, really improved things. And so you'll notice that all kinds of people, you know, the Islamic regions, there was some trouble in the Uyghur regions maybe 5-10 years ago. That's all history now, because those people all have jobs. They have economic opportunity. And, you know, it's really amazing what they've accomplished. So, you know, again, if we want to stop mass migration, create jobs, you know, let's have a corridor of economic development from Texas down into Mexico, all the way to Nicaragua. Let's bring in some Chinese corporations. Let's team up with Daniel Ortega to do it. And we'll build some railway, and we'll open some new businesses and all of that. And we would have no problem with people piling over the border. We wouldn't have an issue with these drug gangs, right? If we did that, you know, or let's build the bridge connecting the United States to Russia over the Bering Sea, the Peace Bridge or the Peace Tunnel. Let's do that and bring the economic growth that's happening in Eurasia and the Russian Far East into America, right? I think that would be a great step forward. I'm also enthusiastic about the Bering Sea Bridge. I always emphasize that because of the fact that it would pivot the American economy westward, away from the NATO countries. Right now, basically, our economy is centered around Wall Street, New York, which is tied in with London. It's that Eastern establishment that's tied in with
finance capital.
Yeah.
Finance capital. It's finance capital. No industrial capital, no commodity capital, nothing to do with labor. It's just about finance capital and complex, intentionally complex financial tools. You know, did you know, just as an example, they've come up with a new way to make money off these tariffs. So what Wall Street's doing now is, so let's say you have a company, the big companies can afford it, but let's say you got a company and you got to buy $250,000 worth of stuff from China, and now you've got tariffs that you didn't have before that are $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. You didn't have that. So what they do is they'll lend you the money. And they'll put you on like a monthly payment basis where you borrow the money from Wall Street to pay your tariffs. You continue to pay them month by month. And of course, as you sell the product or whatever, you can pay off your loans. But here's my point. It's another method to put these businesses in debt. And of course, where do the tariffs go? The price is passed on to the customer, so the people have to pay it. The business has to pay it. China's not paying. The other countries are not paying it. So the American people now are paying for these tariffs, and the business is borrowing money from Citibank and Goldman Sachs. It's another financial tool. When you look at these tariffs and you say, they've created another financial tool. Number one, a gigantic tax that goes directly to the government. And number two, a new financial tool for Wall Street.
Yeah, I was hoping that Trump would take some action to improve things. I haven't seen much good out of the Trump administration as of yet. I'm not saying that they're incapable of it. I mean, it's very possible that as the midterms get closer or whatnot, but Trump ran on a platform that was mixed, but there were some good things he said he would do. He hasn't done them. He just hasn't done them. He's not protecting free speech. Our free speech is very much in threat. He's not ended the Ukraine war. He certainly hasn't solved the Gaza situation, and he ended up bombing Iran, which is something Biden never went that far. Biden bombed Yemen, but he didn't bomb Iran. And I mean, I got to say, I'm not impressed. I'm not thrilled with what the Trump administration has done so far. And I'm hoping that can change. And I like the fact that Comey's been indicted, and it looks like there are certainly fights taking place behind closed doors within the Trump administration. But right now, things are not looking good. I do think, though, that I think that at this point, my feeling is they're going to have to de-escalate with Venezuela, because they would have gone in at this point. You know what I'm saying? I feel like, but who knows, right? They have been violating Venezuela's airspace, and there have been all kinds of provocations. I mean, the argument that Trump has, which is that, well, if I think someone's a drug dealer, right, I can kill them. Right? That has no legal basis whatsoever. Now, Bush said, well, if I think someone's a terrorist, I can kill them with a drone strike. Then Obama continued that. That was not legal either. But this is taking it to a whole nother level. If I say that a ship has drugs on it, I can sink on the ship and kill everyone on it. Like, no, you can't. No, you cannot. Not within your own country, not internationally speaking. And if that ship had indeed had drugs on it, they wouldn't have sunk it. They would have seized it as evidence and used that to prove, because every source is pointing out that Venezuela is inconsequential in the international drug trade. Their argument, the claims they're making, Venezuela is run by drug cartels. Oh, this is absurd. I mean, this is just not the reality. And the United Nations and all kinds of international experts are saying, no, Venezuela is just not the source of our drug problem. There are drugs in South and Central America. It's a big problem. Venezuela is not the center of that problem. In fact, Ecuador, which is under U.S. dominion, they're having a big explosion in the drug trade right now. Why aren't they talking about that? You know, because it's under U.S. dominion.
Because it's his George W. Bush moment. It is, there's weapons of mass destruction in Iran and in Iraq, so we've got to attack him. What the only thing really they had in Iraq was oil, right? So you cooked up a lie so you could steal their oil. What about Trump? Venezuela's got oil. Weapons of mass. No, that ain't going to work. Oh, drugs. Doggone it, that'll do it. What do you think, guys? As Richard Pearl said, he said in a speech, he said, we settled upon weapons of mass destruction because we felt that it was something that everybody could come together on. He literally said that. We settled on that because we thought, weapons of mass. Let's go with that. Now Trump is like, Venezuela. Well, South America, they got drugs. I don't know. What do you think? It is pure imperialism. It is pure W. Bush. We want to overthrow a country and we need to cook up a lie. Let's just make one up. Doesn't have to have any risk. So now he's bit by bit. The problem he has is that Venezuela is a socialist country, and socialist countries believe in armed struggle. And no matter what he does, they've given guns to millions of civilians who will fight. And if they put boots on the ground, if they put American soldiers in Venezuela, they will be cut to pieces. They will be. There's nothing in Venezuela but jungles and mountains with jungles on them. Yeah. It is a gigantic point for ambush. You are in a 24-hour-a-day kill zone, and they will shoot you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the other thing is that, the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States has documents that are available talking about one country in Latin America that has the best anti-drug policies, the most effective anti-drug policies of any country. That's Cuba, right? And read what the DEA has written about Cuba. Cuba has absolutely no drug problem. They have the most effective thing. So if Cuba and Venezuela are aligned, there's Cuban troops in Venezuela. There's a partnership. The Cuban military is trained in Cuba. How would that work? Cuba has the best anti-drug policies in the world, and they're training the military of a country that's completely run by drug cartels. That doesn't make any sense. That's absurd. That's completely absurd. And that's one thing they don't bring up. And in fact, a lot of these, Marco Rubio type people always try to claim, they say, Venezuela is a colony of Cuba. Well, it's not a colony. Cuba is like giving them stuff. I mean, it's sending doctors and building them up. They're not getting rich at their expense. But at the same time, if Cuba and Venezuela are so close, which they are, that would mean Venezuela should be pretty safe from the drug problem, because Cuba has done a better job than anybody fighting that. It's pretty wild in the 80s, right? And this is where it gets very weird. There is this like Reagan nostalgia among the Trump camp, right? And in the 80s, the USA did a lot of its policies in Central America in the name of fighting drugs, right? And in Colombia too. The funding of the paramilitary groups was supposedly to fight drugs. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, I think George Herbert Walker Bush invaded Panama and overthrew Noriega and said, well, he was a drug dealer or something like that. And so it's like they're trying to reenact the policies of Reagan. But the other thing that's kind of interesting is that there was a top Cuban general in the 90s, in the early 90s, who got the death penalty. Do you remember this? And it was for drug trading. It was somebody who had been on the boat with Fidel, was very close to Fidel, but I guess he had been caught sitting down with drug cartels during the, and arranging to try and bring drugs into Cuba. And Cuba was not using the death penalty very much at that point, right? And nowadays in Cuba, they do have the death penalty, but it's very, very rarely used, right? But they actually gave this top Cuban general the death penalty because they just didn't want to have the drug issue. And I think they were also concerned that if there was to be a drug problem in Cuba, that would be the basis of an invasion, because that's what they'd pulled off in Panama, because they overthrew Noriega, in Panama. on the basis of his alleged involvement in drugs, right? You remember that whole thing? It was the USA overthrew the government of Panama. So, it's very interesting to see this. And, when Trump was in office the last time, it was like, there were three guys that were running his Venezuela provocations, right? Elliot Abrams, Mike Pompeo, and who was the other
John
guy?
Bolton, wasn't it?
John Bolton.
John Bolton bragged about trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela, the infamous Bay of Piglets.
Yeah, and Elliot Abrams and John Bolton, they're they come out of Sovietology, right? Which was in the 70s and 80s. If you went and studied, you studied communism, you usually learned to speak Russian, you read all the old Marx and Lenin documents, and you learned about the Soviet system by comparing it to Nazi Germany and arguing that they're the same thing and that America is in like fundamental opposition to that kind of system or whatever. And they kind of focused on communism as being similar to the Nazis and being the same. And, and it was like a whole generation of people that were like the Sovietologists, and they were the right-wing war hawks. That's Gene Kirkpatrick and all of them. That's kind of where they came out of. And then the Soviet Union fell. Oops, they were kind of out of a job. They'd spent their whole time, hating Russia and hating the Soviet Union, and they're a bit old. They're now, they're back in fashion. We're fighting with Russia again or whatever, and Trump has this kind of right-wing conservative, let's make America great again, kind of like Reagan. And so they're old and they're like trying to get some work, I guess. Right now they're thinking, well, I can finally get to do what I trained to do, and then the Soviet Union fell. It's kind of like an actor who like learns a role and then the sitcom gets canceled or something like that. And I mean, it's kind of like that. You can look at it that way. And I remember seeing Elliot Abrams when he spoke at the United Nations, and he was replying to Russia, and every time he replied to Russia, he had to reference something about the Soviet Union. He had to say, well, that's kind of like what the Soviet Union did a long time ago. And it's like, actually, no, it's not. Like, it's just something that Russia said. But it's like he's thinking, 40 years ago, when he studied Sovietology. And that's the neocons, though. That's neoconservatives were the ones teaching the classes. The people teaching him were the former Trotskyites. It was Irving Kristol and Leo Strauss. And it was those folks that were training them. And that's the whole, neocon trajectory. It was out of Sovietology. And I think Victoria Nuland was trained by similar people, right? And it was just in the Ivy League schools they push this stuff. It's very interesting to see how all of this stuff gets pushed around and how foreign policy changes. There's all this fear of nationalism, right? It's like Trump has been such a disappointment, but they're so terrified that he might be something good. That's what I continue to hear when I hear the Kamala Harris interviews, when I hear everything. It's like, we know Trump isn't doing anything, but goodness gracious, he has the potential to possibly do something good, and that scares us. That's what I'm hearing. The news out of Chicago, I'm hearing mixed things out of Chicago. What exactly happened, right? They're saying that ICE went into a private home. But then I'm hearing that this private home they went into, the people staying there were like squatters or something. Have you heard this? Right?
I don't know. I don't know. I've heard mixed stories about it, and it's not clear what happened.
It really isn't. What's clear is that a lot of people on the ground in Chicago are very, very upset about it and very, very angry. And that the allegation is that a lot of people that were U.S. citizens were detained and were arrested because they didn't have ID or something like that. And yeah, it's
Did they go to like a housing project or something?
Yeah, they went into a building that,
and they told everybody had to come out no matter what.
Right, and that they were alleging that building was being used as like a safe house for this gang from Venezuela, the Tren de Aragua or whatever, right? But then I've heard some reports that say, well, this wasn't a place that people were legally living in. It was like that the gang was squatting there or something. Or I don't know what was going on. I'm hearing so many mixed things, but I try not to jump the gun. And some of the stuff that we were hearing on like Thursday and Friday last week was so shrill and alarmist and terrifying, honestly. I didn't want to repeat it just yet because I didn't want to jump on it. And now I'm hearing mixed things. And so it's not clear. What I don't understand is why we're not getting a clear statement from the government about it. That's what I don't like. Why is DHS not coming out and saying, this is what we did and this is what we didn't do, right? There's all kinds of allegations being made. And then I hear the allegations being made by politicians, but then I hear the allegations being made on social media and they don't exactly match up. And I've noticed that too, is that, Trump is accused of doing one thing and then social media twists it into the most catastrophic nightmare you ever heard. And that goes viral. But then you actually listen to what the allegation is. It's bad sometimes, but it's not actually what you saw in that TikTok video or something. Very, very odd.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. You know, something's interesting that came out. A couple of things have come out. The Trump administration released a document, which to me was fairly benign. You know, it was a document, a CIA document that said the Poroshenko government people, when Biden came there to, you know, apparently he gave a speech which was much of nothing, and they were upset, basically saying, you know, why are you guys always pushing back against corruption when in fact Biden's family is corrupt? Okay, first of all, everybody already knows that, so you didn't really release anything of consequence. Number two, you've got a member of Congress, I think it was Representative Luna, now saying out in the open that Zelensky has been sending $50 million a month to a somewhere in the Middle East bank account.
Saudi Arabia. Yeah, that's a member of Congress. Paulina Luna, I think was her name, right? I mean, she came out and said every month he sends $50 million to a Saudi bank. Now, where did she get this information? I mean, she's a member of Congress. She's got security clearance or whatever. That's big. $50 million. Think about that. $50 million going into a Saudi bank account. That's our money, by the way. That's our tax money, right? It's just being whittled away while they've got a budget crisis, while the federal government is shut down. Federal employees are not getting paid, but Ukraine is getting paid, and that money's disappearing. You know, very disturbing. And then the other thing about that document, right? So we know that Hunter Biden has never worked in the energy industry, has no background in natural gas. But right after the Ukraine coup, he got a nice, good-paying job with Burisma Holdings, this natural gas company, you know, and that was pretty corrupt. And it's not clear that he even went over there and was doing anything for them. He was just getting a paycheck from this natural gas company, a really nice one, too, like $30,000 a month, something like that. And so there was a prosecutor in Ukraine who was looking into it. And now Biden brags that he got that prosecutor fired. And he said, I'm not going to send you any more money. You got to fire that guy right away. And he bragged that he got that guy fired. And that was the guy who was investigating the shady deal, right? And then supposedly Trump tried to find out about this from Zelensky. And that's why they impeached him in the first term. Remember, he was just asking, like, do you have info on this or something? And, you know, they had the recording of the phone call and it didn't match, but there was some other communication or something. And they tried to impeach Trump for just asking about that. Right. And then Hunter Biden's laptop showed up during the election. And yeah, I mean, the Biden crime family and the corruption of Ukraine and the corruption of the American government's involvement. There's that other guy. Remember the crypto guy? Well, the crypto guy.
Yeah, Bankman-Fried. That's where we found out that the U.S. was sending all of this money to, it was a crooked crypto company that was crooked as could be, and it had a backdoor, and all of the crypto was disappearing, and there was apparently no way to find out where it was. But we did find out that crypto company was started 20 days after Joe Biden got elected. That Bankman-Fried's parents had like worked for the Obama administration, and that at least his mother did, I'm pretty sure, and that some of the money that was sent to Ukraine, supposedly for weapons, they were invested in crypto. What the hell were we doing sending money to Ukraine? Number one, first of all, that was a big money laundering operation. So they're like, okay, we got this money. We must fight the Russians and we must buy tanks. But I think Bitcoin's going to do pretty well. I like Ethereum. Let's buy $20 million. And of course, the money goes right out the back door, and some of it came right back in the front door to people, members of Congress. It was just one thing is obvious to anybody who's been paying attention. The Ukraine conflict is a big money laundering operation. Do you remember this? They sent a bunch of HIMARS. The Russians reported on this. The U.S. said, we're sending them like 5 HIMARS. And next thing you know, the Russians showed a HIMARS in Moscow, and they're like, yeah, we just went to the Ukrainians and bought one for $300,000. Wow. Like when they came in, and it was like, okay, the HIMARS are here, and we're like, hey, we want to buy one. We'll give you $300,000, and there you go. So we were sending them stuff, and they were just selling weapons on the black market. They were, I read an article today about some Ukrainians that were angry. They were saying this area, all the money was spent to beef up these things and protect these areas. The money was spent, but the areas weren't beef up and protected. Oh, really? No, what do you think happened to the money?
Yeah.
The whole thing was nothing but a big money laundering scam.
Well, and there's many layers to this. First of all, the New York Times did a profile of the most corrupt countries in the world, and Ukraine was one of them. I mean, until this whole Ukraine thing started, everyone acknowledged Ukraine was notorious for corruption. But suddenly, when the war started going, all of a sudden you couldn't talk about Ukrainian corruption. That was Russian propaganda, all this, right? They just forgot about all the corruption in Ukraine. The other thing that stands out, if I do remember correctly, is that, do you remember how they were just kind of demanding everyone donate to Ukraine? You remember that? It was just like donate,
Yes.
donate. Ukraine had a Patreon and everyone, and they like school assemblies. They were like making kids donate at their school
And there was a
assemblies.
crypto account. Remember this? There was a crypto account, and they said, anyone who wants to send money to Ukraine, here's the crypto account. It was in Sam Bankman-Fried's company. $60 million was sent to the crypto account. When the whole thing fell apart, like in the first month or two, $60 million went to the crypto account. There's no records of what went into the crypto account after that, and it's all gone.
And then we also have the New York Times, right? So there was the whole reason that, that 2014, the USA overthrew the Ukrainian government, installed a fanatically anti-Russian government, right? So then there were the Minsk Accords, the Minsk Agreement, which was supposed to, gradually reintegrate the eastern regions, the Donbass, back into Ukraine, recognize their rights. And then we find out, they've admitted that was just to buy time. They were planning to have a war with Russia the whole time. And then the New York Times runs articles about how like hotels in Ukraine were turned into like CIA recruiting. The CIA agents were staying in these hotels and they were meeting with militias and they were setting up, places, and the whole time they were just planning to have this war. There was never 1 minute of trying to not have this war. And that apparently now the latest is Kirill Dmitriev, the Russian official who was in Alaska with Putin. He's saying that they are going to publish information about how basically the Biden administration provoked. I mean, they went out of their way to make sure the invasion did happen, that the special military operation was launched, right? That once Biden was in and Trump was out, the war was going to happen. Like at that point, it was settled. Like they were going to make sure that the invasion, the special military operation took place. And there's more information coming out from Russia. There's so much that Russia has published. And I mean, when I was covering the United Nations, Russia would come out and they would read into the record some stuff that would make your skin crawl about how in Ukraine they would take disabled people and infect them with diseases that, to see what the impact was and if this could be a potential chemical weapon to use against the Russians. And you read the details of what Ukraine was doing, the chemical weapon, the bio labs, you remember that, and the torturing.
Hunter Biden was involved in that.
Yeah. And then
Hunter Biden's company, Seneca, whatever it was, Rosemont Seneca, was involved in getting money, collecting money, and involved with intelligence agencies. I mean, it's well known. Anybody can look this up. Rosemont Seneca was involved with a company called Metabiota, and they were helping to build the labs, fund the labs, and of course, Metabiota was intricately involved with the gain of function stuff.
Yeah, and torturing people and doing medical experiments on people. I mean, it's like, and Russia would read all this stuff in the UN, and then it would go back to the United States and they'd say, oh, another conspiracy theory. And it's like, do you have any evidence? I mean, do you want to debunk what they said? You want to say what you were actually doing? No, you just can't believe it. Russia said it, didn't they? It couldn't possibly be true. It was just, there would be no response, right? And and it's like the amount of information that Russia has made public about what went on in Ukraine in the lead up to this war. If people really have the time, go and look into it. I would recommend just go and read it, right? And if even half of that stuff is true, let's say you don't want to believe it. Let's say you say, you know what, maybe half of it's not true. If half of that stuff is true, it's a nightmare. It's a crime against humanity, what's been done to that country. And you'd think the people who'd be the most angry about it would be the Ukrainians, which apparently a lot of Ukrainians are quite angry about it, right? I mean, a lot of Ukrainians don't particularly they did vote for Zelensky thinking he was going to fix things up and who would bring peace to the country. And he did the opposite. He ended up being the, you know, the guy who led them to war. You know, I mean, a lot of the population in Ukraine, the amount of people that have defected from Ukraine to avoid military service, now they're taking their property. And I mean, it's absolutely crazy. And then the other thing that has been widely pointed out is that the weapons they're using, right, the depleted uranium dust, that's getting rid of crops. They're not going to be able to grow crops like they once did. You know, it's going to take a really long time for Ukraine to recover. Whenever this ends, Ukraine, in order to be back where they were before, I mean, it's going to be generations before they're going to be able to grow as much wheat as they used to grow, before they're going to have an economy again. I mean, the whole country is just being completely destroyed, and they're losing a whole generation of young men, right? A whole generation of young men have been dragged out and sent to go die, you know, in this fight against Russia that didn't have to happen. I mean, Ukraine has gotten the short end of the stick, and not from Russia. Russia didn't want to do this. They've gotten the short end of the stick from the European Union, from the United States. I mean, they basically just pushed them into this, and Ukraine is really, they are the big losers here. They're going to lose out. You know, and it looks like Biden and his family made out like bandits, and, you know, so did a lot of other people with crypto accounts. And oh boy, you know, but then that was the allegation, right? If people like you and I, they said, well, we don't care about Ukraine. We don't care about Ukraine. We didn't want any of this to happen to begin with. We wanted Ukraine and Russia to be neighbors, to get along, to trade with each other. That's what we wanted. We didn't want any of this, right? And that Ukraine has really lost out, and it's not guys like you and me that made them lose out.
Yeah, you're 100% right. Well, I certainly appreciate it, Caleb. We've had a good long hour, and I appreciate everyone. Make sure, if you are subscribing to my channel, check out Caleb's channel. Go over there, subscribe. It's a great channel. He has a lot of good info. If you're a subscriber to Caleb's channel, come over to mine. We're very, very good friends. We work together with a lot of stuff and have been for many, many years. And I certainly appreciate Caleb and all of his hard work, his great books. What's your latest book again?
Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, the whole story. Check it out. Yeah. That's
all right.
Yeah.
It's good stuff.
Thank you. And it's always a pleasure to chat with you, Garland. It really is. We have good conversations, and, you know, you have a lot of interesting knowledge. You know, you're the kind of person who's been a lot of different places, and you see things from many different angles. And I really enjoy that. It makes our conversations very rich.
It is a lot of fun. Thanks a lot, everybody. Caleb Maupin, follow him. By the way, of course, you see everything. I want to thank my Patreon people. I want to thank the people that go to PayPal, buy me a coffee, Cash App, whatever. And of course, don't forget, everybody, I've got a P.O. box, snail mail. So if you want to send a book, people send books, people send magazines, people send donations, whatever you want to send. P.O. Box 32, Glen Burnie, Maryland, 21061. Thank you very much. And the most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. We're out.